Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be presenting the second of our two-part series about the 1975 murder of Martha Moxley. So it's always been tradition for our podcast to spend the month of October covering mysteries which have some sort of Halloween slant to them, and this particular case is one of the most famous examples of that because Martha Moxley was believed to have been murdered sometime during the late evening hours of October the 30th, and her body was discovered on Halloween. Of course, it's such a complicated story that I felt the need to split the whole thing up into two parts. We released part 1 last week on October the 25th, and it outlined the most important facts of the case, so if you haven't heard that episode yet, I'd suggest you go back and listen to it. We're finally releasing our conclusion today on November the 1st, and I'm going to be discussing a lot of the information I previously shared, as well as providing some additional details about the case and sharing my own theories and analysis. So as a brief recap, Martha Moxley was a 15-year-old girl who lived with her family in the affluent Bellhaven neighborhood in Greenwich, Connecticut. On the evening of October the 30th, 1975, Martha went out with friends and was last seen hanging out at a residence of a family called the Skakels, who pretty much lived directly across the street from the Moxleys. Martha was supposedly seen heading home at around 9:30 p.m., but she never arrived, and her body would be found in her family's backyard at 12:45 p.m. the following day. She had been stabbed in the neck and bludgeoned to death with a golf club, and pieces of the murder weapon would be found near Martha's body and were soon matched to a set of clubs from the Skakel residence. Two of the Skakel brothers, 17-year-old Tommy and 15-year-old Michael, would come under suspicion, but it would not be until over 24 years later when Michael was finally charged with Martha's murder. It was theorized that Michael attacked Martha in a fit of rage because she was more interested in his brother, but the case against him was very circumstantial and based largely on incriminating statements Michael was alleged to have made over the years. Regardless, Michael was still found guilty by the jury and received a sentence of 20 years to life in prison, but after serving only 9 of those years, his conviction was overturned after a Superior Court judge ruled that Michael had received ineffective counsel at his trial. Believe it or not, the Connecticut Supreme Court would later reinstate Michael's conviction before reversing their own decision and vacating the conviction again, and finally, in 2020, the state announced that they had no intention of bringing Michael to trial again, as they did not have much faith that they could secure another conviction. So this meant the murder charges were dropped, and Michael was a free man again, but he was certainly not proven innocent or fully exonerated of the crime. As a result, there is still debate about whether Michael was guilty all along, or if someone else, perhaps even Tommy Skakel, was the real killer. The only thing we know for certain is that the actual victim has never received full justice, and there's definitely a lot to discuss about this controversial case, so without any further ado, I now present part 2 of our series on the murder of Martha Moxley. So there are a number of heartbreaking elements to this case, but the one thing that probably bothers me the most is how close Martha Moxley was to her own home when she was attacked and murdered. I mentioned in our last episode that this was the first homicide that the Greenwich Police Department had to investigate in 26 years, and given that Bellhaven was an affluent gated community, no one ever expected a crime like this to take place there. Yet it appears that Martha was in the midst of walking home and only yards away from making it safely inside before she was brutally attacked in her own driveway. Now, on the surface, when you look at the circumstances of how Martha's murder was carried out, it does not appear to be a particularly complicated crime, and not one you'd expect to be without a conclusive resolution nearly 50 years later. However, this case is so complicated that even though this series is 2 parts long, there's a ton of information I cannot include in my episodes because otherwise we'd be here forever. But assuming that you believe that the Skakel family are involved, some people have often listed this as a case study on how wealthy and powerful people can buy their way out of trouble. We know that Martha was last seen alive at the Skakel residence and was bludgeoned to death with a golf club which could be traced back there, but the issue is that there were multiple people who had access to that club, so trying to conclusively prove which one of them used it to kill Martha has always been a challenge. Michael Skakel was convicted of Martha's murder based largely on his own incriminating statements and actions, but even if you believe he did it, there's always been debate about whether the evidence against him was strong enough to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. While the Skakels were mainstays in Belhaven, the Moxleys had only been living there for 14 months before Martha was killed. But prior to this, Dorothy Moxley said that she and her family loved living there and commented about how nice most of the residents were towards her both before and after this tragedy. But once the Skakels decided to stop speaking with police, the whole atmosphere in Belhaven seemed to change, and the Moxleys decided that they just could not continue living there and moved away. It's very tragic that Martha's father, David Moxley, died only 13 years after the crime took place at the age of 57, but it sounds like he was a workaholic who continued to spend long hours at his job, likely as a means of dealing with the grief of losing his daughter. But even after David passed away, Dorothy Moxley and her son John have handled this whole situation with great class and dignity. I'm glad that Dorothy was able to live a long life until the age of 93, though I cannot imagine the roller coaster ride of emotions this case provided during the last few decades of her life. What's particularly sad for Dorothy is that Martha had been grounded for staying out late the previous weekend, but Dorothy decided to cut Martha some slack and allow her to go out with her friends for mischief night. There's no way she could have anticipated that Martha would not return home alive, and I'm sure Dorothy's decision haunted her for the rest of her life. So to recap, Dorothy and John witnessed Michael Skakel get convicted of Martha's murder in 2002, his conviction get overturned in 2013, his conviction get reinstated in 2016, his conviction get overturned again in 2018, and a final decision by the state not to retry him in 2020. While all this was going on, the Moxleys never wavered from their belief that Michael was guilty, and technically only had to serve 9 years in prison for the crime. After Michael was released, and all this legal wrangling was taking place to decide what to do next, Dorothy said she pretty much reached the point where she didn't even care if Michael returned to prison and had to serve more time. She still received validation over the fact that Michael was officially found guilty in a court of law, and no matter what, she knew he was still going to have to live with the torment and stigma of what he did to Martha for the rest of his life. Once again, Michael was not released from prison because he was proven innocent. He had his conviction overturned because some judges believed he had ineffective counsel at his trial, so unless new evidence emerges someday that exonerates him, many people are always going to believe he's a murderer. But of course, even though Dorothy seemed to find peace with how everything turned out, the whole situation would be incredibly tragic if it turned out that Michael really was wrongfully convicted and the real killer managed to get away with it. Now, the truly ironic thing is that if Michael did this and had been charged with Martha's murder back in 1975, he was still a minor at that time, so the maximum sentence he would have served was 4 years in a youth treatment facility. If Michael admitted to what he did, showed remorse, served his time, and then been released at the age of 19, it's possible that no one would even remember this case anymore. But knowing what kind of man that Rushton Skakel Sr. was, I'm sure he was going to do everything in his power to ensure that this crime did not taint his family's name. One of the reasons this case has attained so much notoriety is because Rushton's sister was Ethel Skakel Kennedy, the widow of Robert F. Kennedy, and you can do an entire podcast series on the number of scandals the Kennedys have been involved with and how many members of that family did not receive the punishment they deserved for their actions. So in many people's eyes, Michael Skakel was just another person attached to the Kennedys who escaped proper justice. However, even though the Skakels were a very wealthy and prominent family, their connection to the Kennedys has been a bit exaggerated, and the two families were not particularly close at the time of Martha's murder. While the Kennedys are perhaps the most famous Democrat family in the history of the United States, the Skakels were actually conservative Republicans and caused some friction when they openly stated that they did not vote for John F. Kennedy when he became president in 1960. But of course, whenever you talk about this case, the Skakels and the Kennedys are always linked together, as it was William Kennedy Smith's rape trial in 1991 which helped bring the spotlight back to the Moxley murder. Another prominent scandal occurred in 1997 when Michael Kennedy, one of RFK and Ethel's 11 children, was accused of committing statutory rape with the family's underage former babysitter. Michael Skakel was Michael Kennedy's cousin and had actually been working for his energy company, but ironically, one of the main reasons the scandal came to light was because Michael Skakel spoke out to the Boston Globe and they published a story about it. There was talk about charging Kennedy with statutory rape and making Skakel the star witness to testify at his trial, but the babysitter's family ultimately decided that they did not want her to face the massive publicity, so the investigation was dropped. While the option still would have been open to charge Kennedy if the family changed their minds, he wound up being killed in a skiing accident on New Year's Eve in 1997. Needless to say, Michael Skakel claimed that he faced a lot of friction from members of the Kennedy family for speaking out against his own cousin, and it would have been interesting to see how the murder investigation against him would have played out if he had testified as a witness at another highly publicized trial. In fact, this whole situation is one of the reasons why Michael wanted to publish his own book and wound up making those incriminating statements to the ghostwriter, but we'll talk more about that situation later on. But whatever issues might have existed between the two families, Michael still managed to develop a close relationship with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. when they became adults, as RFK Jr. credits Michael for helping him get sober, and they bonded by attending alcoholism recovery meetings together. RFK Jr. would become Michael's most outspoken supporter after he was charged with murder, and has spent the past 2 decades campaigning for his innocence. Now, whatever skeletons the Kennedys might have in their closets, you cannot deny that they've experienced an unspeakable amount of tragedies, and so many members of that family have died premature deaths. Well, you can pretty much say the same thing about the Skakels, as even though Rushton Skakel Sr. was definitely not the nicest man or greatest parent in the world, he had to deal with a lot of awful events in his life prior to Martha's murder. In October of 1955, Rushton lost both of his parents, George and Ann Skakel, when the private plane they were traveling in crashed in Oklahoma, and in September of 1966, history would repeat itself when Rushton's oldest brother, George Skakel Jr., was killed in a plane crash over Idaho at the age of 46. If that wasn't enough, George Jr.'s widow, Pat Skakel, would die 7 months later at the age of 39 after she choked on a piece of meat. And of course, in March of 1973, Rushton's own wife, Anne, passed away after a long battle with brain cancer, leaving him a widower with 7 children. Given the circumstances, I can understand why Rushton might do everything in his power to prevent one of his sons from being implicated in a murder, which occurred just a few years after he lost his wife. Of course, Rushton had an alcohol problem and was known for being abusive towards his children, and did not exactly help them deal with the grief of losing their mother. And since he was often out of town, the kids were usually free to do whatever they wanted without supervision, so this was definitely not a stable household. Given that Michael developed a drinking problem at the young age of 13, I'm sure the death of his mother and the lack of sensitivity from his father played a huge role in that. Out of all of the children, Michael and Tommy reportedly displayed the most aggressive, unstable behavior while they were teenagers, which is why it's never been hard to imagine either of them bludgeoning Martha to death with a golf club. But it seems like the Skakels' big downfall took place when Rushton hired the Sutton Associates during the early 1990s to do their own independent investigation into the crime. I think he was hoping their findings would officially clear Michael and Tommy's names, but instead, it revealed that they had changed their original stories that they shared with police back in 1975 and only painted them in a more suspicious light. If Rushton had never done this, I'm not sure things would have ever reached the point where the authorities filed charges against Michael. So the series of events which led to Michael's eventual indictment were set in motion when a copy of the Sutton Associates report on the Skakels was leaked to Dominic Dunn, who is one of the most prominent true crime writers in America. In case you're not familiar with his backstory, Dominic's own daughter, Dominique Dunn, was an actress who was best known for her role as Dana Freeling in the iconic horror film Poltergeist, But on October the 30th, 1982, only 4 months after the movie came out, Dominique was strangled to death by her ex-boyfriend, John Sweeney. The attack caused her to fall into a coma, and since she no longer had any brain activity, her parents consented to take her off life support 5 days later, and she passed away at the age of 22. The case became the subject of controversy because when Sweeney went on trial for the crime, the jury elected to acquit him of second-degree murder and only found him guilty on the lesser charges of voluntary manslaughter and misdemeanor assault, so Sweeney only received the maximum sentence of 6 years in prison and was paroled after serving 3 years. Understandably, Dominic Dunn was outraged by the whole situation and did everything he could to shadow Sweeney following his release, making sure everyone knew he was a murderer. Dominic often wrote about cases in which wealthy and powerful people used their money and influence to get away with terrible crimes. Given his own personal experience with losing his daughter, it's not hard to imagine why he would have taken an interest in the Moxley murder, though some people, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., believe that this clouded his objectivity. Dunn's fictional novel, A Season in Purgatory, has been seen as a thinly veiled depiction of the Skakels using their influence to prevent Martha from receiving justice, though the character who turns out to be the killer in that story is more closely modeled on Tommy rather than Michael. Of course, perhaps the most infamous example of a powerful celebrity getting away with murder was when O.J. Simpson was acquitted of killing Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, and Dunn was right there to provide coverage during the trial. One of the biggest turning points of the trial was when recorded interviews surfaced of Mark Fuhrman using racist language, which allowed the defense team to push forward the narrative that Fuhrman planted evidence to frame O.J. for the murders. Now, I've always believed that's a load of bunk, as O.J. was guilty as sin of that crime, but Fuhrman still became one of the most hated men in America following the verdict. Regardless, Fuhrman soon started a new career as a true crime author when he wrote a book about the Simpson case titled Murder in Brentwood, and Dunn thought he might be a good choice to perform a new investigation into the Moxley case and publish a book about it. This is how Murder in Greenwich came about, and I think Fuhrman was hoping that this would provide some sort of redemption story for him, as bringing justice to a 20-year-old unsolved murder would help make up for the role he played in allowing another murderer to get away with it. Prior to the release of the book, I think the general public perception was that Tommy Skakel was the most likely candidate to be the killer, so it took some people by surprise when Fuhrman reached the conclusion that Michael probably did it. In November of 2002, 4 months after Michael's trial concluded, a made-for-TV movie adaptation of Murder in Greenwich was released, which starred Maggie Grace as Martha Moxley and Christopher Maloney as Mark Fuhrman. Since Fuhrman is not a particularly likable individual, I found it amusing that the filmmakers seemed to be overcompensating for that by casting Elliot Stabler from Law & Order to play him. But even though Fuhrman seemed to achieve some sort of redemption by spreading awareness about this case and paving the way for a conviction, what if this led to the wrong guy being sent to prison? So I first became familiar with this case when it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1996, but even though the segment focused on the odd discrepancies in the stories provided by both Michael and Tommy, I came away believing that Tommy was more likely to have done it. But when Michael was charged with the murder a few years later, and I heard the theory surrounding his motive, I had to acknowledge that, yes, it seemed more logical that Michael would violently attack Martha because he was jealous she was more interested in Tommy. I've always believed that Martha's diary has provided a lot of posthumous insight into what might have happened, and she had written that Michael had once drunkenly confronted her and told her to stop leading his brother on. But of course, what has always been the major sticking point in this case for me is that multiple witnesses provided Michael with an alibi and maintained that he was at another location miles away when Martha's murder took place. So to believe that Michael is guilty, you have to accept that these witnesses would have been willing to lie for Michael under oath and commit perjury, but since the jury at Michael's trial convicted him, they obviously must have felt this is what happened. When you research this case online, one common misconception that people seem to have about the case is that Tommy was Martha's boyfriend, and it's often forgotten that Martha actually had another boyfriend named Peter Zaluka. Granted, judging by some of the entries in Martha's diary, it sounds like Peter had issues of his own, and given that she openly wrote about kissing other boys, I don't get the sense that her relationship with Peter was that serious or long for this world. If Martha had been flirting and kissing Tommy on the night of the murder, You could construe this as Peter having a motive to kill her in a jealous rage, but it sounds like police were satisfied that Michael was miles away at home when the crime took place and eliminated him as a suspect. And to add another element of tragedy to this story, Peter passed away in February of 2011 and was only 51 years old. I have to say, hearing about the interactions between Martha and Tommy is quite uncomfortable, because even though she may have been interested in him, it sounds like Tommy could be overly aggressive and she often had to fend him off. This is corroborated by entries in Martha's diary and also by two of her friends, Helen Hicks and Jeffrey Byrne, who said that Tommy put his hand on Martha's leg while they were sitting in the Lincoln Continental together, and Martha told him to remove it. Other than Tommy, the last confirmed witnesses to see Martha alive were Helen and Jeffrey, who both said they decided to go home after seeing Tommy push Martha onto the Skakel residence's front lawn and climb on top of her. Even though Tommy would later describe these actions as being playful, I always got weird vibes from them, and it seemed to make Helen and Jeffrey uncomfortable. Tommy had a documented history of mood swings and aggressive behavior during his teen years, which may have stemmed from the fact that he suffered a serious head injury at age 4 after he fell out of a moving car. Since Tommy seemed to come across as the type of guy who would have held a feeling of entitlement about girls doing whatever he wanted, it was not hard to believe that if Martha kept fighting him off, Tommy could have flown into a rage, ran back into his house to grab a golf club, and then tracked down Martha to her driveway and violently attacked her. People who knew Tommy said that prior to the murder, it was not uncommon to see him randomly walking around the family property with a golf club in his hand, so it makes sense that this might be the first thing he would think to grab if he was looking for a weapon. Tommy initially told police that he parted ways with Martha and last saw her walking home at around 9:30 p.m., but would change his story several years later and claim that they spent the next 15 minutes or so engaging in consensual sexual activity on the front lawn, such as heavy petting and masturbating each other to orgasm. Well, if this story is actually true, then it seems less likely that Tommy was the killer, since he would have had no motive, but when we have witnesses who said that Martha prevented Tommy from touching her leg only moments earlier, would she really have been willing to go through with any sexual activity with him? The whole situation looks even more suspicious for Tommy, since he originally said that he spent this time period in his bedroom working on a school assignment about Abraham Lincoln, even though it turned out that no such assignment actually existed. But what only adds to the confusion is that Michael also changed his original story, as he told police that he returned home at around 11:30 p.m. and went straight to bed, but then later admitted that he attempted to peek through Martha's bedroom window and masturbated in a tree. At no point has anyone ever attempted to push forward a scenario where Tommy and Michael committed the murder together, so if Martha was killed by only one person, why did both brothers lie and change their stories? This isn't even a situation where the brothers appear to be attempting to cover for each other, because the interactions with Tommy and Martha would have taken place when Michael said he was at his cousin's house, and the peeping and masturbation incident did not occur until 2 hours later. The explanation that the two brothers provided for lying to police back in 1975 was that they feared their actions might get them into trouble with their father, and to be fair, that's not entirely implausible. Even though Rushton Skakel was an absentee father who often left his kids alone and allowed them to do whatever they wanted, he was also a very religious man who had strict conservative views about sex. While Rushton did not seem too concerned about the fact that Michael was becoming an alcoholic at age 15, he reportedly once attacked Michael when he caught him reading Playboy magazine, and he may have become outraged if he found out his son had masturbated on someone else's property, or that Tommy was engaged in heavy petting and mutual masturbation with another girl. In fact, Rushton was such a devout Catholic that he apparently once said that he considered masturbation to be, quote-unquote, equivalent to the slaughter of millions of potential Christians. So yes, even if Tommy and Michael are both innocent and their stories are 100% true, this issue with their father could be a reason why they felt compelled to lie to law enforcement during a murder investigation. Though admittedly, it is pretty disturbing that Rushton may have been willing to help one of his children cover up a murder, but drew the line at them participating in sexual activity for the purposes of anything else but conceiving children. I'm certainly uncomfortable with the idea of stating with 100% certainty that Martha engaged in these sex acts with Tommy because she's a murder victim who is no longer around to confirm or deny this story. But I will acknowledge that Tommy's account may be supported by Kenneth Littleton, who claimed that he went outside the Skakel residence at around 9:45 p.m. after the family's housekeeper told him she heard an odd noise. Littleton said that he thought he heard noises from behind one of the bushes on the property, but never went over to investigate, and if his account is accurate, perhaps he heard Martha and Tommy fooling around together. We can keep debating the legitimacy of Tommy's story, but one thing I'm sure we can all agree on is that it still seems more believable than Michael's masturbation story, which is just incredibly bizarre on all levels. Even if Michael's story was true, the big question people have always had is why he would even admit to something like that, regardless of his guilt or innocence. After all, it's not like there were any witnesses who caught him in the act, so it's likely no one ever would have found out unless Michael admitted to it. Since Michael's trial got such extensive media coverage, this whole situation even got referenced during one of Jay Leno's monologues on The Tonight Show, where he joked that some people would rather be found guilty of murder than suspected of masturbating in a tree. This story first came to light when Michael shared it with the Sutton Associates in 1992, and the most common theory which has been pushed forward is that this was the same time period when DNA profiling was starting to become a prominent tool in criminal investigations. So if Michael was aware of this and was paranoid that his DNA had been collected from the murder scene, he made the preemptive decision to come up with a cover story to explain why it was there. But of course, there are a number of holes with that theory. It's been reported that Michael had already shared this masturbation story with other people in the years prior to being interviewed by the Sutton Associates. In fact, he may have shared it as far back as the late 1970s and early 1980s, when no one would have been thinking about DNA evidence. But the much bigger issue is that the tree Michael said he climbed was on a different section of the property, as Martha's body was found underneath an entirely different tree 300 feet away. So even if Michael did leave his DNA behind, it's not going to implicate him in the crime, and I seriously doubt that police would have collected bark from this random tree on the off chance that the killer's semen might be there. Besides, in most versions of Michael's story, he says he did not even ejaculate, as he said that he had started masturbating, and then after realizing how stupid this whole situation was, he climbed back down the tree. If true, then there would not be any DNA evidence to find, but it's worth noting that when the Moxley family testified at Michael's trial, they claimed that this particular tree was too slender for any human being to climb, so this suggests that innocent or guilty, Michael's entire story may be fabricated. However, an alternate explanation is that Michael was not concerned about DNA evidence, but rather the possibility that the new investigation by the Sutton Associates might uncover a witness who recalled seeing him in the Moxley yard that night, so he had to concoct a reason for being there which did not involve murder. An additional complication is the fact that during his time at the Yalon School, Michael allegedly confessed to one of his fellow students, Gregory Coleman, that he had returned to the murder scene and masturbated on Martha's body 2 days after she was killed. We'll talk about the other issues with the supposed confession later on, but we know this part cannot be true, since Martha's body was found and collected by the authorities the following day. Regardless, there has been speculation that there might be elements of truth in Michael's story, and he could have masturbated at the murder scene at some point, perhaps right after he murdered Martha. One of the most unusual elements of this crime is that Martha was found with her pants and underwear pulled down, but she was not penetrated vaginally or anally. Forensic pathologist Dr. Henry Lee was called upon to provide testimony at Michael's trial, and he confirmed that there was no direct forensic evidence linking him to the crime. So yes, along with Dominic Dunn and Mark Furman, Dr. Lee is the third individual from the O.J. Simpson trial to be associated with this case. I should add the disclaimer that even though Dr. Lee has worked on a number of famous cases, his methods have come under serious question these past few years, as a pair of innocent defendants named Sean Henning and Ricky Birch spent over 30 years in prison for a murder they did not commit before the Connecticut Supreme Court overturned their convictions. Lee had been the state's key forensic witness at both men's trials, but falsely testified that a key piece of evidence had tested positive for blood, which was later proven to be untrue. And only a few months before this episode's release, a federal court found Lee liable for fabricating evidence, and the state agreed to a $25.2 million settlement for a lawsuit that the two defendants had filed. I'm not sure if any of this has relevance to the Moxley murder, but since there has been a call to perform a new review on every case Lee worked on, I felt I should mention it here. When Lee testified at Michael's trial, he said that the blood spatter evidence indicated that Martha's pants and underwear had already been pulled down before she received some of the more severe blows, and she was likely lying on the ground when this occurred. He also believed that 2 reddish marks found on Martha's inner thighs were consistent with bloody hands attempting to push her legs apart. So perhaps Michael, or whoever the killer was, had been planning to rape Martha, but never went through with it. A number of people in the neighborhood, including Dorothy Moxley, reported hearing some dogs barking around the approximate time period Martha is believed to have been killed, so if these dogs witnessed the crime, they may have spooked the killer and prompted them to run away before the assault took place. That also explains why the killer did not stop to collect the broken pieces of the golf club, even though it was evidence that could potentially incriminate them. While no semen was found at the scene, they never did check Martha's back or buttocks area, and since she was found lying face down, I guess it's possible that Michael could have masturbated over her while she was in this position, and then became paranoid about this years later when DNA profiling became a thing. Or maybe he decided to masturbate in another section of the backyard away from her body. The point is that if you believe Michael was guilty, his stories about masturbating on the body or masturbating in the tree may have some elements of truth to them. But before we talk any more about the case against Michael, let's look at other people outside the Skakel family who have been pushed forward as alternate suspects. The most prominent of these names is obviously Kenneth Littleton, but we'll get back to him in a minute. One employee of the Skakels who doesn't get discussed as much is their handyman and gardener Franz Joseph Wittine, a German immigrant who had spent years working for George Skakel Jr., but was hired by Rushton following his brother's untimely death in 1966 and lived in a basement apartment on the Skakel property. Now, Wittine is definitely a weird, creepy dude, and while there's no evidence that he killed Martha, I'm not so sure he was investigated as thoroughly as he could have been. Wittine apparently liked to tell stories to the Skakel children about how he had been a German soldier during World War II, and since the Nazis could get away with whatever they wanted back then, he personally raped and beat a number of women. While Wittine was never criminally charged with anything, there were always rumors that he sexually assaulted and groped teenage girls after emigrating to America, and had a particular thing for blondes, which was Martha's hair color. He also apparently liked to make advances towards Julie Skakel and some of her teenage girlfriends, so much so that they became scared to visit the Skakel residence. Wittine was married and his wife had worked for the Skakels, but they fired her a few months before Martha's murder took place. Wittine gave some inconsistent statements about his alibi on the night of the crime, and it was not exactly airtight, as he claimed he was alone in his apartment listening to the radio before he fell asleep at 10 p.m. That may very well be true, but there was no way to verify this, and since he lived on the Skakel property, Wittine would have had access to the golf club which was used as the murder weapon. What's particularly unusual is that Wittine decided to retire and quit working for the Skakels in March of 1976, 5 months after the murder, but if he had remained employed only a few months longer, he would have completed 20 years of service as an employee for a Skakel-owned company and qualified for a pension from them. This could be construed as a sign that Wittine wanted to get away from the area in order to avoid police scrutiny, but he actually agreed to speak with the police a short time after he quit. He told them that in his last months working for the Skakels, the family seemed to be treating Michael differently than usual and were acting exceptionally nice towards him. So Wittine had a gut feeling that Michael may have known something about Martha's murder. But it does not sound like this lead ever went anywhere, and Wittine passed away in January of 1997 at the age of 82. Law enforcement has never publicly expressed any suspicion towards Wittine, and most of the incriminating information about him has been shared by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in his attempts to link the crime to anyone else besides Michael. But Wittine's abrupt departure makes me think of the incident from 1977 where Michael allegedly made some incriminating statements to the family's chauffeur, Lauren Ziccarelli, leading to him also deciding to terminate his employment with the Skakels. So perhaps Wittine just wanted nothing more to do with a family whom he suspected of potentially covering up a murder. So now we have to talk about Kenneth Littleton, who may very well be one of the biggest red herrings of all time. If Littleton is innocent, then his story is a truly tragic one, as being associated with this crime seemed to cause his entire life to go into a downward spiral. Remember, Littleton was hired by the Skakels to be a live-in tutor and moved into the residence on the very same day Martha was murdered. Before this took place, Littleton had been asked to take the Skakel children out to dinner at a fancy country club, and he would later say that he believed he had struck gold by getting this job, but everything went downhill for him very quickly. During the early days of the investigation, it sounds like many people believed that Littleton was a much more likely candidate to be the killer rather than someone from the Skakel family, and he didn't help himself by going on a crime spree less than 1 year after the murder took place. If one of the Skakels did kill Martha, and the family wanted to cast suspicion towards someone else, then Littleton was a convenient scapegoat since he was one of the few people who would have had access to the murder weapon that night. But one of the biggest issues with accepting that Littleton was the killer is that while he certainly had the opportunity to commit this crime, he had no apparent motive. I mean, you can infer that when Martha visited the Skakel residence that night, Littleton could have laid his eyes on her and then decided to follow Martha to her residence in order to assault and kill her, but he has always maintained that he never met or saw Martha and had no idea who she was until he learned about her murder. I mean, we know that Littleton went on to exhibit unstable behavior and commit crimes later on, but unlike Francois Tyne, we don't have any allegations that Littleton liked to prey upon teenage girls. Remember, Littleton was not only hired to tutor the Skakel children, he was also offered free room and board to live in their fancy house, and was now in a situation where he got to have dinner at highbrow country clubs and rub shoulders with rich folks. If he decided to throw that away by murdering an innocent girl on the very same date he started this new job, then he has got to be one of the most brazen criminals of all time. In 2019, the Oxygen Network released a 3-part documentary series about this case titled Murder and Justice, The Case of Martha Moxley, and it featured an interview with Martha's brother, John. He said that at one point, he took the initiative to visit Littleton and question him about Martha's death, and while Littleton broke down crying multiple times, he never actually confessed to the crime and continued to maintain he had nothing to do with it. John said this meeting left him convinced that Littleton did not kill his sister because he felt that Littleton's emotional reaction was genuine, as he came across like someone who was devastated because false accusations had ruined his life, not because he was overwhelmed with guilt over something he had done. For decades, Littleton mostly shied away from the spotlight, but in 2017, he agreed to do an interview with the New York Post and also appeared on an episode of the Investigation Discovery true crime series Guilty Rich. By this point, Littleton was residing in an assisted living facility, and he also shared a disturbing new story about Michael which had not been told before. In the weeks following Martha's murder, Littleton said that he found a dead chipmunk on the grounds of the Bellhaven Country Club, which had been mashed with a golf club, and crucified after being nailed to a patch of grass with golf tees. When Littleton confronted Michael and asked if he had done this, Michael apparently replied, quote, "Who else could have done it, Kenny?" So assuming that Littleton is telling the truth, make of that story what you will. What I find unique about this case is that even though Littleton and Tommy Skakel have always been two of the top suspects, they pretty much provide each other with partial alibis during the approximate time period Martha's murder took place. I previously mentioned that around 9:45 p.m., Littleton was watching television when he was asked to go outside the Skakel residence to check on an odd noise, and even though he didn't see anything, he thought he heard noises from behind the bushes, which could have been Tommy and Martha fooling around. Littleton then went back into the house and continued watching television, and said that Tommy joined him on the couch at around 10:15 p.m. One thing I've always found fascinating is that the movie The French Connection and the TV show Monty Python's Flying Circus became such pivotal pieces of evidence at establishing a timeline. Back in 1975, there were no VCRs or DVRs, so if you wanted to see something on television, you actually had to watch it when it aired. This was also long before the days of home video or streaming, so it was always a big deal when an Academy Award-winning film like The French Connection was shown for the first time on network television, and a number of people from the area distinctly remembered watching it that night. Tommy said that he sat down and started viewing the film during one of the most famous chase sequences of all time, where Gene Hackman's character goes after a bad guy who is trying to get away from him on an elevated train. Since this particular scene would have aired on television at around 10:15 that night, it helped investigators put together their timeline. So assuming that Tommy and Littleton are both telling the truth, that doesn't really give either of them a lot of time to kill Martha. I mean, it's certainly feasible, but I find it telling that neither of them reported seeing anything unusual about the other that night. I mean, if Tommy had stabbed Martha and bludgeoned her to death with a golf club, he would have presumably needed time to clean the blood off himself before joining Littleton on the couch, and I'm not sure a 17-year-old could appear so calm and collected only about 30 to 45 minutes after committing a murder. As we're going to talk about soon, there have been allegations about family members covering for each other in this case, but Tommy and Littleton were not family and had just recently met, so there would be no reason for either of them to cover for each other. Remember, when Littleton was called upon to testify in front of the grand jury 2 decades later, he was offered immunity for any involvement he might have had in Martha's murder. This would have been the perfect opportunity for him to nail Tommy to the wall if he had seen anything suspicious that night, but it was Michael who wound up being indicted. So the other potential suspects from outside the Skakel family are Adolf Hasbrouck and Burton Tinsley, and their alleged involvement is based entirely upon the statements of Tony Bryant, who was 14 when the crime took place and did not come forward with information about these two men for over 25 years. Bryant maintained that he stayed silent because he was a black man, and his mother advised him that if he got involved in the investigation and placed himself in Belhaven on the night Martha was murdered, the police would have pinned the crime on him. But once he saw Michael Skakel get convicted for a crime he did not commit, he decided he needed to make things right. Now, I'll state right up front that even though I'm quite skeptical of Bryant's story, I have no idea why he would decide to completely make this up unless you believe the conspiracy theories that members of the Kennedy or Skakel families paid Bryant off to fabricate a story to help get Michael out of prison. Well, if that's the case, the strategy did not work, since Bryant refused to testify and share his story under oath without receiving immunity, even though he never admitted to being directly involved or present for Martha's murder. This may be nothing more than a coincidence, but it's interesting how Bryant first started sharing this story around the exact same time period his very famous cousin, Kobe Bryant, got embroiled in his own highly publicized scandal when he was charged with sexual assault. So perhaps Tony Bryant just decided he wanted his own brush with the spotlight. The main reason it's easier to believe the likes of Kenneth Littleton or Francois Tyne being alternate suspects is because they actually lived on the Skakel property at that time and would have had access to the golf club, whereas it's harder to imagine outsiders like Hasbrouck and Tinsley getting a hold of it. When I first heard Rushton Skakel's explanation about how his children often left golf clubs lying around in the yard, and an outsider could have just come along and grabbed his deceased wife's 6-iron to commit murder, I rolled my eyes. However, the Skakel household was incredibly dysfunctional, and since the children did not have much adult supervision, it was apparently common practice for them to never pick up after themselves and just leave things lying around until the servants cleaned up. So yes, this may actually be a rare example of a residence where you could just find random golf clubs lying around outside. But the big issue is that I'm very skeptical that Hasbrouck and Tinsley could have even made it onto the Skakel property to grab this club to begin with. Remember, Belhaven was an affluent gated community filled with rich white people. In order to enter the neighborhood, you had to pass by a guard booth, and the area was also patrolled by a private security force. Yet there were no reported eyewitness sightings of Hasbrouck, Tinsley, and Bryant in Belhaven on the night of Martha's murder, and I think it would have been very difficult for a group of black guys to have spent the evening there without attracting any attention. It seems like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the one who feels most strongly about Hasbrouck and Tinsley being the real killers, and he's put a lot of emphasis on the supposed African-American hairs which were found on the police blanket used to wrap Martha's body. But this blanket would not have been used until several hours after the killer or killers committed the crime, and since there was one black police officer who showed up at the murder scene when Martha was discovered, I don't think it's implausible that the hairs could have belonged to him. Even though Tony Bryant has pushed forward this story that Hasbrouck killed Martha because he had an obsessive crush on her, Hasbrouck has always maintained that he never met Martha and had no idea who she was. Regardless, Bryant claimed that just under 4 weeks before the murder, he, Hasbrouck, and Tinsley attended a dance in which Hasbrouck set his eyes on Martha and became jealous that other guys were talking to her. I mentioned earlier how Martha's diary entries have provided a lot of potential insight into the motive behind the murder, and when RFK Jr. was interviewed on the aforementioned Murder and Justice series, he claimed that Martha's diary specifically stated that she saw Tony Bryant and 2 strangers at a dance in early October of 1975, which supposedly corroborates Bryant's story. But, hilariously enough, the show then revealed that RFK Jr.'s statement was false, because while Martha's diary did have an entry about this dance, she never mentioned Tony Bryant's name or used the word strangers. Instead, here is an exact quote of the entry that Martha wrote, quote, October 4th, Dear Diary, tonight was a Sacred Heart dance. I went with Margie and Jackie. When we walked in, some guy asked me to dance, then some other guy asked me. It turned out to be a slow dance. It was Stairway to Heaven. At the first part, he wouldn't even let go. I also danced with Dickie, Neil, and Peter Zemensky, a lot with Dickie. End quote. Well, Dickie just happened to be the nickname for a 15-year-old friend of Martha's named Richard Burns. He was also interviewed on Murder and Justice and would confirm that he was at this dance, but had no recollection of seeing Bryant, Hasbrouck, or Tinsley there. And herein lies the issue with RFK Jr. being Michael's biggest advocate. He has a tendency for stretching the truth, or flat out making stuff up, in order to support his narrative. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but yes, RFK Jr. has become quite a controversial figure, mostly because he's got some very strong anti-vaccine views and has spent 2 decades promoting the conspiracy theory that vaccines cause autism. And if you think it's commendable that RFK Jr. has advocated for the innocence of his cousin, keep in mind that he's done the same thing for the man who assassinated his own father. Yes, RFK Jr. has expressed his belief that Sirhan did not fire the fatal shot which killed RFK Sr. back in 1968, and has openly campaigned for Sirhan's parole and release from prison. I will admit that RFK Jr. has brought up a few interesting points to support Michael's innocence, but you just can't trust that all the information he shares is accurate. So let's take RFK Jr. out of the equation and look at the actual case against Michael. Regardless of whether you believe in Michael's guilt or innocence, I think one can still struggle with the ethical question about whether his guilt was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Like I've reiterated numerous times, there was no physical evidence linking Michael to the crime, so the case against him was very circumstantial and based largely on incriminating statements he was alleged to have made over the years. But if Michael was guilty all along, I will say that he has no one to blame but himself for getting convicted. I will acknowledge that it was pretty unethical for the prosecution to present doctored audio to the jury during closing arguments when they played the recording of Michael speaking to the ghostwriter of the book he was working on. As you recall, Michael was talking about the incident where Dorothy Moxley visited his residence on the morning after Martha went missing, and how he was worried she had caught him masturbating on the tree on her family's property, stating, quote, "Oh my God, I hope to God nobody saw me jerking off." But the prosecution cut off the words jerking off from the audio, so it sounded like Michael said, quote, "I hope to God nobody saw me." Yeah, regardless of how you feel about Michael, that tactic was very questionable, and cutting off those 2 words makes a huge difference in how one can interpret that statement. To recap, Dorothy went to see Michael at around 8 a.m. that morning, but Martha's body was not discovered until 12:45 p.m. If Michael was completely innocent, he would have no reason to believe that Martha was dead at that point, or that her body was lying in her own backyard. The abbreviated sentence, "I hope to God nobody saw me," makes it sound like Michael was worried Dorothy had seen him on her property around the time he killed Martha, which sounds pretty damning. But if he was worried that Dorothy saw him jerking off in a tree, then that provides an alternate explanation for why he would be so paranoid when she showed up at his door. Dorothy said that Michael seemed hungover when she spoke to him that morning and was skipping school, which could be interpreted as a sign that he was drinking heavily to overcome the guilt of what he had done. But since Michael already had a drinking problem during this time period, and it may have been nothing out of the ordinary for him to be hungover, I'm not sure we should read too much into this. Of course, it probably wasn't the brightest idea for Michael to attempt to write a book when he was a suspect in an unsolved murder, but I think this decision might have been inspired by his involvement in the Michael Kennedy babysitter scandal, since his slogan for the book was going to be, quote, "I am a member of a family sick unto death with generations of secrets." But if Michael did kill Martha, you could interpret this project as being his own version of O.J. Simpson's book, If I Did It. If Michael really did make all these confessions and incriminating statements about the murder over the years, then he may have been tormented by guilt and was just anxious to get everything off his chest. A good chunk of these alleged confessions took place during the 2 years he was a student at the Elan School, but the two big issues are, 1. How reliable are the witnesses who heard these confessions? And 2, if Michael did make the confessions, how many of them were by his own free will? Well, if you want to go down a major rabbit hole, try doing some research on the Elan School and its troublesome founder, Joseph Ritchie. I could not possibly get into all the details here since an entire podcast series could be made on this topic, but even though the Elan School was supposed to be a place to help out troubled kids, it went well beyond the acceptable boundaries for behavioral modification therapy and frequently subjected these kids to severe physical and mental abuse. The school closed in 2011, but it's possible that if their questionable practices had been more well known at the time Michael went on trial, there might have been more resistance to using Michael's supposedly incriminating statements from there as evidence. I mentioned during the last episode that once word reached the school that Michael was a potential suspect in a murder, Joseph Ritchie forced him to wear a sign which read, quote, "I am an arrogant rich brat, confront me on why I killed Martha." And during group therapy sessions, Michael was forced to endure abuse from other students inside a boxing ring and was pretty much told that this abuse would not stop until he admitted to what he did. But even so, Michael apparently never made a full-fledged confession during these sessions, as he went from claiming he didn't do it to saying that he didn't know what he had done. If you've studied enough wrongful conviction cases, this does seem like one of those situations where police coerce a suspect into making a false confession by subjecting them to many hours of interrogation until they finally tell the authorities what they want to hear in order to make the ordeal stop. These Elan School confessions came to light after the Moxley case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and two former students, Gregory Coleman and John Higgins, came forward to share their accounts of what Michael had said to them many years earlier. But both these witnesses had their own credibility issues, and you can't help but wonder if their actions were motivated by the fact that a $50,000 reward, which was later increased to $100,000, was being offered for information. Coleman was the one who claimed he heard Michael say, quote, "I can get away with murder, I'm a Kennedy," but he was also a drug addict with a criminal history who admitted he was on heroin when he testified in front of the grand jury, and he died of an overdose before he could testify at the trial. So you can see how problematic this might be, that Coleman's depositions could be admitted as evidence, but Michael's defense team never got the opportunity to cross-examine him and potentially tear his story apart. John Higgins claimed that Michael shared a story about grabbing a golf club on the night of the murder and not being able to remember what happened since he was blackout drunk. But even if Higgins was telling the truth, many of the details of Michael's account do not fit the facts of the crime. He supposedly said that he grabbed the golf club from inside his garage while a party was taking place and then ran into the woods. But the 6-iron used to kill Martha was actually taken from a bin near the back door inside the Skakel residence, not the garage, and there was no party taking place there that night, and no woods in the neighborhood that Michael could have run into. The aforementioned Murder and Justice series features an interview with another Elan School student named Chuck Segan, who also attended the school while Michael was there. Segan claimed that Higgins never said anything about Michael's incriminating statements until the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1996, and he decided to phone up Segan to tell him about it. But Segan says that during his time at the Elan School, he learned not to trust Higgins because he was a liar who loved getting people into trouble. So once again, was Higgins a credible witness? There was another issue involving the conflicting testimony from Mildred X, a neighbor and family friend of the Skakels, who told the grand jury that Rushton had once confided in her about Michael expressing his concern that he was so drunk on the night of Martha's murder that he may have forgotten killing her. Yet when Mildred testified at Michael's trial, she changed her story and now claimed that Rushton told her Michael had offered to take some sodium pentothal, aka truth serum, but never specifically said anything about Martha's murder. The Moxley family were greatly disappointed by Mildred's changing testimony, as they claimed that ever since Martha was killed, Mildred had always told them that she personally believed that Michael might be responsible. For his part, when Rushton himself was called to the stand to testify at the trial, he claimed that he had no recollection of this conversation with Mildred, but he also acknowledged that he was suffering from dementia at this point and now had trouble remembering things in general. All that being said, even if you discount all the testimony from Mildred and the witnesses from the Elan School, that doesn't change the fact that Michael allegedly made incriminating statements about the crime in the years before he was even sent to the school. I'm not sure I'd put too much stock into the testimony from Michael's barber, Matthew Tucciaroni, because Michael's statement about how he quote-unquote killed before was very vague and could have been taken out of context. But I am deeply troubled by the testimony from the Skakels' former chauffeur, Lawrence Ziccarelli, who claimed that in 1977, Michael had made statements about having done something bad and was so perturbed that he nearly made an attempt to jump off the Triborough Bridge in New York. Say what you will about the credibility issues of Michael's so-called confessions at the Elan School, but if Ziccarelli is telling the truth, and I see no reason to believe that he's not, then this suggests that Michael was in a very bad place at the time and feeling suicidal. Indeed, Michael did seem to lead a self-destructive lifestyle in the years following Martha's death, which is what ultimately led to him being sent to the Elan School. While I remain a bit skeptical about the testimony from Gregory Coleman and John Higgins, there were a total of 7 witnesses from the school who testified at the trial, and in particular, I do think there is some believability in the story shared by former Elan School student Dorothy Rogers, who testified that Michael told her that his family feared that he may have killed Martha and sent him to the school in order to keep him under the radar and hide him from investigators. I don't necessarily believe that all the stories about Michael's alleged confessions are true, but since there appear to have been so many stories about them from a variety of different sources, I certainly can't discount them all. But we've now reached the point where I want to talk about what may be the one most important piece of evidence, and that's Michael's alleged alibi on the night of the crime. Like I said earlier, if Michael is guilty, then that means that multiple witnesses lied under oath on his behalf in order to help him cover up a murder. To recap, Michael's story has always been that at around 9:30 p.m., he left his residence so that he and 2 of his brothers, Rushton Jr. and John, could drive their cousin Jimmy Terrian home. They then spent the next hour or so watching Monty Python's Flying Circus on TV at Jimmy's place before Michael was driven back home and arrived at around 11:30. Now, even if this story was true, the prosecution still thought they could poke holes in Michael's alibi by pushing forward the idea that Martha could have been killed as late as 1 a.m. after Michael already returned to the neighborhood. But I don't buy this theory and believe that the estimated time of death of between 9:30 and 10 p.m. is probably the correct one. We have numerous witnesses from the neighborhood, including Dorothy Moxley, who recalled hearing some dogs barking wildly during this time period, which meant they may have seen Martha get violently attacked and reacted accordingly. But putting that aside, the main reason I do not think Martha was killed at around 1 a.m. is because there are no confirmed eyewitness sightings of Martha after she was last seen at the Skakel residence at 9:30 p.m. So where could she have been during that 3.5-hour window? We know that Martha had already been grounded for staying out late the previous weekend, but her mother decided to cut her a break and allow her to go out for mischief night, provided that she made it home by her 9:30 curfew. It doesn't make logical sense for her to walk away from the Skakel residence and then just disappear for a few hours, so she was probably walking across the street to make her curfew before she was ambushed and attacked in her driveway. And if Michael was confirmed to be miles away during this time period, then he could not have committed this crime. So we know that on the day Martha's body was found, Rushton asked Kenneth Littleton to take Tommy, John, and Jimmy Terrian to his family's hunting lodge in New York State, and the prosecution inferred that Rushton had found out Michael committed the murder and gathered everybody at the lodge to concoct a cover story for Michael before they spoke to the police. I know the defense tried to provide an alternate explanation that Rushton just wanted to get his children out of the neighborhood and keep them safe because there was a killer on the loose, but that explanation doesn't make much sense when you consider that Rushton's two youngest sons, 11-year-old David and 9-year-old Stephen, stayed behind. And it also seems pretty odd that they would decide to bring Jimmy to the lodge since he did not even live in Belhaven. At Michael's trial, additional testimony was provided by James Mackenzie, who had been the lawyer for Rushton's company, the Great Lake Carbon Corporation. Since Rushton was still out of town when the news hit about Martha's murder, he had asked Mackenzie to visit the Skakel residence to watch over the children, and Mackenzie felt that Michael was the most difficult child to control that day, as he said he was acting overly agitated and hyper. So if the Skakel family did learn that Michael committed the murder, I could see John, Jimmy, and Rushton Jr. conspiring together to provide Michael with a false alibi, but we have another witness, Dennis Osorio, who also recalled seeing Michael watching TV at Jimmy's residence that night. At the time, he was the boyfriend of Jimmy's sister, so he did not have any familial ties to the Skakels, and no reason to perjure himself and lie about something like this decades after the fact. But on the other hand, he was testifying about this decades after the fact, so even if Osorio was telling the truth, how reliable was his memory? How do we know he didn't see Michael at the residence on a different date besides October the 30th, 1975? Regardless of the credibility of Osorio's testimony, it was still a mistake for Michael's defense attorney, Mickey Sherman, not to have called Osorio to the stand to testify at the trial, as his account may have influenced the jury. This one issue is pretty much the main reason that Judge Thomas Bishop decided to overturn Michael's conviction on the grounds of ineffective counsel and felt that he was entitled to a new trial. And while we're on the subject of Jimmy Terrian's residence, we have to talk about the alleged discovery of the golf club handle on the family's property by a groundskeeper in 1999. The broken handle from the murder weapon was likely used to stab Martha in the neck and may have contained the killer's fingerprints, but it was never recovered. Since the handle of another club from the same set had a label with Ann Skakel's name on it, I can definitely see why the perpetrator or someone associated with the perpetrator would have decided to get rid of it. There were a couple of former police officers who told Mark Furman that they were certain they saw this handle in Martha's neck at the murder scene before it mysteriously disappeared, so if you're a conspiracy theorist, you could assume that there was some sort of cover-up where the Skakels convinced the Greenwich PD to get rid of the evidence. But if that's the case, it really doesn't make much sense for this golf handle to be found on the Terrians' property, which was 11 miles away from the murder scene. I guess somebody could have taken the handle there and attempted to dispose of it after the fact, but why not get rid of it at a location which could not be linked to the Skakel family? Since this handle was never found, and there was no official report of it being handed over to the police, like the groundskeeper said he did, I remain skeptical of this whole story. Anyway, the main piece of testimony used to discredit Michael's alibi at the trial was provided by Julie Skakel's former best friend, Andrea Shakespeare-Renna, who was also at the Skakel residence that night. She said that she left at around 9:45 p.m. and recalled seeing Michael run past her on the lawn while Julie yelled out, quote, "Come back here, Michael." If accurate, then this would have taken place after the car containing John, Rushton Jr., and Jimmy had already left, but once again, we're talking about an eyewitness who was trying to recall events which took place decades earlier, so how reliable is Andrea's memory? To be fair, Julie partially corroborated Andrea's story by testifying that she did see someone running through the yard that night, but she thought this person may have just been some random neighborhood kid who was cutting across her property because it was mischief night. However, during his closing argument at the trial, prosecutor Jonathan Benedict played a recording of an interview Michael had given when he was being investigated by the Sutton Associates in 1992. Michael said that when he returned home from Jimmy's residence that night, he noticed that Julie's bedroom door was shut and stated, quote, "I remember that Andrea had gone home that night." That might not seem like a significant statement, but it actually provides a small contradiction with his own alibi. Remember, Michael supposedly left to go to Jimmy's house at 9:30, Well, Andrea left the Skakel residence and went home at 9:45. So if Jimmy returned at 11:30, how could he have known that Andrea went home since he was not there to personally see her leave? He may be putting too much emphasis on that statement, but the prosecution seemed to think that it was important, and with this one little slip of the tongue, Michael may have inadvertently revealed that he did not actually leave his property that night when he said he did. And therefore, he had the motive, means, and opportunity to go after Martha and kill her. So after going through all the evidence, where do I personally lean in this case? Well, to be honest, once you read the full Sutton report, you pretty much have to discount the idea that Martha was killed by Kenneth Littleton or some black guys from New York or anyone outside the Skakel family. The only logical conclusion seems to be that she was killed by either Michael or Tommy. I still think it's a very big deal that Rushton Skakel specifically hired the Sutton associates with the intention of clearing his son's names, but they completed an investigation which only managed to make the two brothers look even more suspicious. While there are definitely some things which still bother me about Tommy, he does have an independent eyewitness, Kenneth Littleton, who could confirm his whereabouts shortly after the time period when Martha was believed to have been killed. I can accept the idea that Michael's own family may have lied in order to provide him with a fake alibi, but I do not believe that Littleton would do the same thing for Tommy, particularly since Littleton always had to live under a cloud of suspicion, and it would only benefit him if suspicion transferred elsewhere. Tommy was obviously a troubled teenager, but unlike his brother, there don't appear to be any reported cases of Tommy making incriminating statements or veiled confessions to Martha's murder. And even though Tommy did lie to police back in 1975, it's possible he did this because he engaged in sexual activity with Martha and did not want his father to find out. Instead of making himself look more suspicious, Tommy's lying may have only diverted suspicion towards his brother because it creates a possible motive for Michael to kill Martha. It's been reported that Michael asked her if she wanted to accompany him to his cousin's house, but Martha declined since she needed to get back home in time for curfew. If true, this may have prompted Michael to stay behind at his own residence instead, and he soon heard or saw Tommy and Martha fooling around, which drove him into a rage and prompted him to go grab his late mother's 6-iron golf club. We know from Martha's diary entries that Michael had gotten drunk on at least one prior occasion and confronted her about leading on his brother, so it really does seem clear that Michael was jealous over Martha being more interested in Tommy than him. So after Martha and Tommy parted ways, Michael then followed Martha home and attacked her in the driveway with a golf club before dragging her into the backyard and stabbing her in the neck with a broken handle. He may have pulled down Martha's pants and underwear with the intention of sexually assaulting her, but for unknown reasons, this did not occur, and Michael eventually fled the scene. Out of all the scenarios presented in this case, I definitely think this one is the most likely to have happened, but the question still remains about whether the evidence against Michael was strong enough to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and convict him. While I have to admit that I still struggle with this, and if I had been on the jury at Michael's trial, I honestly can't say for certain if I would have convicted him. While I am inclined to think that Tommy did not do this, his potential involvement does present reasonable doubt, and I know that Mickey Sherman faced criticism for not doing more to point at Tommy as an alternate suspect and compelling him to testify on the witness stand at the trial. But I find it interesting that the two brothers had become estranged, and when Tommy showed up in the middle of the trial, this apparently marked the first time in decades that Michael and Tommy had been in the same room together. If Michael killed a girl that Tommy had been interested in, and the whole crime became this big dark secret within the Skakel family, you can understand why Tommy would be inclined to keep his distance. In the end, this is just a horribly tragic story, but if Michael was the guilty party all along, he still had to serve 9 years in prison, and considering that he was a juvenile when this crime took place, is that enough punishment for him? Well, in some circumstances, I might say yes, but considering that Michael got to live nearly 25 years as a free man before his arrest, and has never admitted any culpability to this day, I'm not sure I'd say that justice was served. But the most important voice in this matter is the victim's family, and while Dorothy Moxley never wavered from her belief that Michael was guilty, she did experience some satisfaction over the fact that Michael got convicted at all, and no matter what, Martha's death is always going to follow him around and haunt him for the rest of his life. Even if by some miracle, new evidence against Michael was to emerge after all this time, it's very unlikely that he will be taken to trial again and sent back to prison. All that being said, should you happen to have any information or evidence that points to someone else besides Michael Skakel being responsible for the murder of Martha Moxley, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 5 years, our Patreon page has released dozens of exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a Halloween-themed bonus episode about the Guardian UFO case, which explores the odd 1991 sighting of a mysterious object in a field just outside my hometown of Ottawa, Ontario. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discuss yet another Halloween-themed mystery, the unexplained 1988 death of David Stone. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 50 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Vanessa Y and AR. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week, and join us again next Wednesday as we present another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.